So Games Workshop talks candidly about their own game balance, admit that their previous update was a bit on the weak side, and promise some bigger changes to come. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today I thought we'd go over the contents of Games Workshop's latest Metawatch article, though I guess this time it was more of a 20-minute long video. Perhaps not one of their flagship ones, more sort of talking about the general ethos around game balance, a few thoughts on events, some early reactions to the balance Dataslate changes going into effect, and talking about what might be to come, giving us a few more focused hints as to what to expect for the next updates in January. Perhaps the single key phrase from the video was the phrase "it hasn't had the impact that we'd hoped," and I feel like the video was maybe in response to a fair bit of feedback that they got from the community, particularly the general discussion on the internet around the previous balanced data slate was that it really wasn't going to do all that much. Broadly, every single change that they made, buff and nerf, was in the right direction, but at least a few of the changes just felt like they were so minor that they may as well not have bothered, perhaps particularly the one to Space Marines. I'd say again with this MetaWatch article, it really is quite refreshing to have actual Games Workshop official sources saying that yes, things aren't 100% perfect with game balance, and maybe we could have done things a bit differently. I feel like in the not very distant past, you'd very rarely hear Games Workshop saying anything bar positive things about their game system. So if they're going to provide commentary articles on their own game, they're going to be a lot more credible if they are actually a little bit more free to criticise the things that aren't working quite right, and not just literally talk about positives and try and upsell the negatives, despite it not necessarily reflecting reality. It does seem that they've really changed course a bit on this, between this and that Votan video, where they basically said, yes, we did get it wrong in this stage, and I generally think that this new approach is something that's probably worth encouraging as a community. Hopefully, if these more realistic discussion posts are met by a bit of positive feedback, it'll be something that they actually sustain into the future, rather than just lapsing back to pretending that everything's fine, even when things are all out of whack. Beyond that, one of the main things that they went through in the video was talking through the changes and roughly what sort of impact they'd had on people selecting armies and how much it might have been affecting faction win rates, the primary mechanism that they're using to balance the strength of armies. The main thing that they said regarding win rates was that they haven't really changed too much in the week or so that the balanced data slate has been in full effect for tournaments. But to be honest, I kind of feel that with the amount of data that they probably have access to, it's still probably not quite enough to differentiate between just a few percentage points, which is all that the changes are likely to have impacted anyway. I feel like when accounting for a bit of randomness thrown in, you're probably not going to be able to zero in on whether or not Tyranids have lost a percentage or two of win rate until at least a good few more weeks down the line when a lot more people have played more games and maybe have adapted the faction to the new rules and maybe pivoted away from Leviathan potentially as well. I can't imagine that they've got all that much data to work with at the moment, as tournaments often take a week or two to implement the changes. Most of the big ones don't suddenly implement the balanced data slate if it drops the week before, as everyone's already got their list together. I wouldn't have time to change things over a few days. In any case, going through the 5 factions that they did change in the balanced data slate, I think no one was really expecting Space Marines to be affected at all by one edge case secondary change. I feel like out of any of the changes of the previous data slate, that was pretty pointless. I'd imagine that the ADMITS will be getting at least a little bit stronger, with Vanguard returning as a really powerful damage hoover against non-vehicles. 1 CP to basically spam out an average of 30 wounds on your targets really is quite big, even if they don't have much AP. Hard to expect 1 unit change to propel an entire faction into the mid-tier, but at the same time that is one powerful option that was far less good before. Then for Tyranids and Harlequins, they gave some pretty meaningful nerfs to the 2 most played sub-factions in them, Leviathan and Light. It does appear that from faction data, both Tyranids and Harlequins now have Kraken and Twilight as their most favoured sub-factions, though with Light and Leviathan still having decent showings both. They seem to remain the second most played sub-factions at time of recording, it would seem. I feel like even if it isn't quite enough to bring them into line with the other armies, it's definitely going to be a power knock. If you know of the most powerful way to play an army, then the fallback option is by definition going to be a little bit weaker, though it might not necessarily be much weaker. Finally, for Necrons, it might make the Silent King just a little bit less mandatory, though he still seems very good. The win rate does seem a little bit weaker than it was previously, though again I'm not sure we've really got enough data to say that that's not just a bit random and week on week variation. Overall though, the takeaway does seem to be that there's no enormous changes there, and there's still some factions that are decently ahead and decently behind. Having said all that though, that very much does put the focus on the next batch of changes, and they did say themselves that points cost might be a bit more freeing for making more focused changes to certain armies, They only tend to actually update the points cost for things for balance purposes twice a year alongside the chapter approved books, as opposed to doing it mid-season with the balance Dataslate changes. Just broadly from what they were talking about, it does sound like they're going to be updating a whole bunch of armies when the points changes come out, and also not just limiting themselves to the armies that they feel are too weak or too strong, the armies outside their 45 to 55% win bracket that they consider kind of fine. First up, they did confirm that Flamers of Zinj are indeed getting a points bump. They did kind of hint that last time round, but again they pretty much singled them out and said yes, you are going up. Maybe not too surprising this one, perhaps out of just about any unit in 40k at the moment, you can point at them and say, yes, they should probably be a bit more when you compare them to just about any other things that other factions can run. Many demon lists use 3 big squads of them, and when it gets to the point that any other chaos army that can ally them often tends to do so and run lots of units of them just for a raw power boost, it's kind of obvious that something's a bit out of line there. I suspect that they'll hit them at least fairly decently hard, probably at least up to 30 points, maybe 35. I feel that in general Chaos Demons as a faction can probably take it though. While the Flamers are a really strong unit, in general are performing pretty great at the moment, and hopefully it might put a bit more emphasis on some of the other units in the Codex so they don't just seem flat better than a lot of things. The other faction that they talked about in a little bit of detail are Genestealer cults. They said that they are going to be getting some points changes this time around. I guess that's good news for worshippers of the Four-Armed Emperor. They have had a few updates where literally nothing has changed for them, and it hasn't been particularly exciting. They do call out that their win rate is kind of fine at the moment, though personally I do feel that they're an army that you have to play very, very smartly just to get to the mid-tier level. They have had a little bit of success at top tournaments, but not very much. While they do have access to a whole bunch of tools that can break the normal rules of the game, a lot of their datasheets just tend to be a little bit on the mediocre side to counteract that, and even if you play with them quite smartly, it can mean that you're not really getting any better than an army that's just got a bunch of raw power. I thought it was kind of interesting though that they talked about them as a codex that's got some obvious picks and some less obvious ones, and maybe not so great internal balance. I kind of feel as Games Workshop codexes go, the Genestealer cults are actually better balanced internally than most of them. There's definitely still some units like Aberrants, Abominants, the Jackal Alphas, and Reductus Saboteur that are kind of underwhelming, but beyond that I'd say the vast majority of the rest of the codex is pretty usable, and I feel like that's a lot better than a lot of other armies that you could look at. Maybe on a not so very dissimilar power, armies like Orcs, Thousand Sons, or Custodes, I feel like a lot of those just revolve around a few core choices in a lot of different armies, or at least the Genestealer cults can make some pretty decent use of most of their selections. In any case, as said, I would expect some points drops to those units, at least some of them. It would be cool to have Aberrants being a bit more dangerous again. They were generally quite satisfying to use as a massive great big hammer unit that can actually do some heavy lifting, and I feel like they're just maybe a few points too expensive for their role at the moment. Finally, besides changes and updates and things, they did talk a lot of tournaments and events and things as part of their interview. I feel like perhaps one of the more interesting offhand comments, though, was mentioning that the Blood Angels won a tournament and how they don't just look at that and say, yes, all Space Marines are fixed as soon as they win one event, which I guess at least some people out there will be happy to hear. I did see a lot of people commenting and posting on Reddit and things that now Space Marines have won one event. Games Workshop would just hold them up as an example to say that yes, Space Marines are doing fine. Look at this one player who did very well with one of the stronger factions of them. So hopefully that's a bit of a rebuttal to some of those points. I feel like that might have been a thing that they might have done in their old way of doing things, where they just tended to take a look at what was winning tournaments and not really pay much attention besides that. It at least appears that they're taking far more of a statistical approach at the moment though, so one skilled player having a good day with a mediocre faction isn't going to change the way that they do things. In any case, I found that one another really quite interesting video from them. It does still feel like a bit of a novelty Games Workshop, both talking a bit more candidly about how they rebalance things, and also being a bit more realistic and talking about how things aren't 100% perfect. I'll be interested to hear your guys' thoughts though. What do you make of their points and takes? Look forward to hearing your thoughts as always. If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics, or I'll certainly keep up with Games Workshop's news and updates. I do tend to post 40k videos just about every day. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, which is how I can afford to keep on making so many videos like this, covering Warhammer news and releases. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things happen next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways, with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.